There you go. That's perfect. Okay, so the other, just hold your foot to the brake good. We didn't quite have it maxed out before, but that's definitely maxed out right there. Look at that flex. Now again, this tire isn't dropping all the way down because there's not really any spring force on it. The spring is totally unloaded right now. Yeah, longer springs coming soon, but brake line isn't tight. It's good. Wow, that's really tucked in there. Oh yeah. Right, new rear shocks for the Jimny, the JEB23W. These are some random shocks off Amazon. I'll put the part number and the model in the description of the video. But I was looking at lengths, and these are 3.5 inches longer, which is what we wanted, because we're running about a 2.5, 3 inch lift. But we got to look at is how much longer they are compressed, right? Because compressed length is what's going to tell you how much you need to drop your bump stops. So, Charlie, go ahead and compress that one. I'll compress this one. Okay. Ow! All right, put it next to there. Can you measure the difference with the other hand? Because I got to keep this one really compressed. Just try to go from the center of the eye to the center of the eye. All right, so about 2 inches longer compressed. So if I have to jump the bump stop a little bit. All right, those are the rear shocks we're gonna try to make work. Here's the front shocks. I actually splurged for some KYB made in Japan XLG shocks. They're pretty similar size to these. Don't remember what vehicle they're off of, but I basically went through the entire spreadsheet of KYB shocks, made in Japan. There's the part number 343161. And is there a part number on these guys? These are like big box shocks off Amazon. These were super cheap. These are A518601s. So these are a full 4 inches longer up front, which is good because my front springs are probably going to be a little bit longer because I have springs coming off a JB33, which is the 4-cylinder model, and I have the 3-cylinder model, so I'm probably going to get more lift in the front. All right, I'll compress. No, right up on the shelf. Yep. All right, so again, about 2 inches longer compressed. So hopefully I don't have to drop the bump stops a full 2 inches because that would obviously suck. You want to get as much travel as possible up this little truck. But definitely needed longer shocks. Well, that one's not gas charged anymore. Definitely need longer shocks for the lift kit, so we'll see how it works. These were about $30 a piece, maybe $35. These were $20 a piece, so hopefully it'll work out okay. I do expect to have to trim down these bushings. I couldn't find shocks that were quite this narrow without spending a ton of money, so the bushings are a little wider, but in my experience, take a circle grinder, zip, zip, good to go. Okay, so what I just did was I compressed the shocks to full compression, and I put marks where the dust shield makes it down to. So you can see that this shock is a little over 8 inches of travel, and this shock is right at 8 inches of travel. What's interesting is that both these shocks were advertised around 7 inches. So I find that a lot where you get actually a little more travel than you pay for. The measurements are kind of conservative. So that's actually a lot of travel for a truck as narrow and small as this. So hopefully, if we can utilize all this shock travel, we're gonna add a lot of ride quality. So I'm gonna install them on the truck, and then we'll use the corner travel index ramps back there to max the truck's flex out. And we'll see how close we're getting to these green marks from here when we start contacting the bump stop. Ideally, you wanna contact the bump stop at least ½ an inch before your green mark. And that tells you once the bump stop compresses, you're not gonna be destroying your shocks. So we'll look at it. We may have to put some shims behind the bump stops, drop them down a little bit. Not a big deal if we have to do that. But I'd like to be able to run these shocks with my stock springs for now, because right now I'm waiting on the new springs from Japan, and the factory shocks really don't give you much down travel. You can see how much shorter they are. So even if you run these with a factory spring, we don't have to drop the bump stops. That's giving us much more down travel, which will help the flex a lot. Off-road, it's very limited from the factory. I think they do it for stability probably, but that is weak sauce. All right, I just modified these shocks to fit the Jimny. Again, this is not perfect, but these are $20 Amazon shocks, so I don't really mind doing this to them. You can see where I cut the ends of the sleeves off on this shock on both sides, so now that's 32 millimeters, just like the top one. And on the bottom, I only did one side, because this is a single shear setup, so I just put a slightly longer bolt to make up for it, and that spacer there helps it get away from the axle tube. So on the bottom, I cut one side off. You You see on the top, I did both sides. And the front shock's really easy. You just have to trim them down a little bit or grind them down. So these were sticking out a little too far, so I cut them down. Now they're 32 millimeters, and this will install on the front. We still have to do a bunch of experiments with up travel and down travel and all that, but the shocks are ready to bolt up. I just installed my 3-inch longer rear shocks on the Jimny. Now it's got some serious droop. As you can see, the factory springs obviously aren't long enough. But what I want to show you is the brake line. So the brake line for the rear comes down right here. It's a little too short, but if you remove the keeper, I'm not sure where I put it, it went flying. If you remove the keeper and just put a zip tie like I did right there, the line is just a little more slack at full down travel. So didn't need longer brake lines in the rear. Instead, I just replaced the keeper with a zip tie. That's fine for a cheap vehicle like this. Okay, so the front sway bar is still hooked up, so the front isn't flexing much. But I think I may have found the perfect rear shocks. So we've got a lot more tire tucking into the fender well because it can drop down the other side, which lets it pivot up in there. And I don't think we're gonna have to drop the bump stops. So if you remember, I made a green mark on the shock body. Now we've got the truck jacked up to full flex. And we're gonna take a look at how close our green mark is to bottoming out. So we've got about 1.5 inches until our green mark bottoms out, which is looking pretty good. And as you can see, we're on the bump stop. All right, I got the front extended travel shock on. Wow, what a difference. You can actually see the axle now. The sway bar is disconnected, of course. So this is full droop on the front. The front had a lot more clearance than the back to start out with, but we still added another 3.5, 4 inches, which is excellent. There's a lot of space up here for articulation. Again, these factory springs are way too short. We'll mend that soon. We got our long KYB shock here. For the brake line, it's a little tight. I removed the keeper and zip tied it just like the back to drop it, 2 inches, but not quite enough. I also had to remove the bracket on these ABS wires and replace it with a zip tie because they were getting pretty tight. So they used to have a little bracket. I'm not sure where it went off to. It used to be a bolt with a bracket. Now it's just a zip tie, but it should be just fine. This is not a road truck, but yeah, that is a lot of articulation out of a little tiny baby truck. It'll get a lot cleaner once I delete all the vacuum lines for the vacuum hubs with my manual hubs that are on the way from Japan. I can get rid of a lot of these lines back here. But for now, and this is how we're gonna roll. Definitely need some longer springs, but I think it'll be all right. Just don't drive real fast over big bumps. And it's looking like I'm probably gonna have to drop the bump stops in the front. That's kind of expected because I kind of need to do it anyway. So right now, this shock can go up 4.5 inches before it bottoms out, but you can see on top of the perch, this axle can go up about 5.5 inches before it starts contacting the bump stop. So we are gonna have to drop the bump stop in the front or add a shorter shock. Not a huge deal because the front is getting lifted a little higher than the rear, so dropping the bump stop is not that bad. Also, the front obviously steers, so to clear a bigger tire, it's usually required to drop the bump stop anyway. This is kind of a goofy looking bump stop, so I gotta see how to get it off and try to adjust it. It looks like it might be welded. All right, we got the Jimny on the flex ramps for the very first time. We only got one ramp set up right now, but it made it pretty far up it. You could probably go a little farther. We're just taking it easy. It's tucking nicely there. This is drooping well. Oh yeah, look at that tuckage. Oh yeah, definitely room for a bigger tire, I'll tell you that much. Yeah, these less than $100 of shocks totally transform the suspension on this truck. It's got twice as much travel in the rear and about 70% more travel in the front. But what we got to check now is all the things, right? Brake lines, ABS lines, make sure none of those are binding. Also the vacuum lines for the front air operated hubs, you got to check. You got to check your max up travel to make sure you're not going to over compress one of your shocks, all that stuff. So these ramps are really good for checking all of that stuff before you go out on the track. Green line is touching the shield, which means that shock is at full compression and the bump stop is about 1/4 inch away from being kissed. So we got to drop the bump stop 1 inch, which is perfect for the 3.5 inch front lift I'm doing on it, and better tire clearance and all that. But it's going to be a little annoying to drive until we get the until we get those longer springs in. Let's get a view under here. Looking good. So I'm just welding everything. I had to beat this thing up to get it off there though. It'll still work just fine. But yeah, basically I'm adding 1 1/8 spacer on the bottom of there to keep the shock from over compressing. Nice and flexed out. The shock is not bottoming out. Shock is close, so that it pivots from the radius bar right there. The shock is farther back, so there's a little bit of a motion ratio between where the shock mounts and where the bump stop is.